All right. So thank you everyone for joining. We are so excited to have you here. And just to give a very brief background of how this event got started, a lot of political candidates are starting to talk more and more about mental health care and why this is an important thing to be running on as far as political campaigns go. I think people are really starting to recognize how important this is to individuals and their daily living. So my thought was, well, hey, let's create a forum where we have, different political candidates come on and talk about this, because one of the ways that we're going to spread an awareness and a push for more mental health resources is just to talk about it nonstop. And if anyone knows me, they know that I will talk about mental health care nonstop if I'm allowed to. So I reached out to a lot of different candidates from all over the state of Ohio. And, I greatly appreciate this. Many of the ones who I contacted are either busy with their own campaigns, which as a city council candidate myself, I 110% understand. And others were very gracious in that they were like, well, this isn't my area of expertise. So while I don't necessarily want to speak on this at this time, I would like the opportunity to learn more about this. Then comes Morgan Harper. I reached out to her after she made a post on Twitter about mental health needs. And I was like, well, let me offer her the same invitation. And she was the first and only candidate who was just like, let's do this thing. So I appreciate her and her willingness to come on and talk about this very, very important issue. So Morgan, welcome and thank you so much. I know that you are so busy, so I am just deeply humbled and appreciative of you.
No, thank you, Stacy, for putting this together and shining a light on a really important topic. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. Would you like to start by just sharing a little bit about yourself and your campaign and maybe why you feel that mental health is important to your campaign?
Yeah, so for folks who don't know me, my name is Morgan Harper. I was born here in Columbus, and a bit of how I got into politics has to do with just my lived experience here. I was given up for adoption. I lived in a foster home as an infant and then was adopted and raised on the east side of the city. And like a lot of us, I mean, my family went through a lot early on, and I had that wake up call of, one financial life shock that can just throw everything off, and you either go totally off the rails or you all find a way to restabilize. And we were able to restabilize, but that feeling never really leaves you. And that was one of the driving factors to me to just figure out what is going on here. This doesn't line up with the image of the American dream that we're sold, and I've got to figure it out. So I went to school and did all these things, and then realized that no, we actually have a really clear understanding of the policies that would allow everyone to get a fair shot and have regular access to mental health care. But what we lack is political leadership to fight and get it done. And, I've had the experience of working in Washington. The federal level is where I've been focused, but there are things, and this politician blockade is present at every level of government, as I'm sure that you know.
Completely agreed. So Morgan is going to be on for the first half hour of this event. So to respect her time, we'll kind of jump right in with some questions. First of all, just because one of the most important things in regards to mental health care access and really getting this on people's radar is reducing the stigma. And you reduce the stigma by being vulnerable and talking about it yourself. So the first question that I'll pose to Morgan, and that I'll answer myself as well, is how is your mental health right now?
Yeah, well, it's funny when I saw that as one of the questions we would discuss. I was like, oh, well, that's actually not a question I get asked very often while running for U.S. Senate. I would say that my mental health is strong. And just, a little bit about my personal journey is, but, I've had to, like a lot of people, address issues in my past to be able to come to a stable place as an adult. And we all, or most of us, are very lucky if you haven't gone through certain elements of trauma, and being able to deal with those and find a way to, never goes away, but how that isn't driving your emotional reactions to things, for example. So that's a process I've gone through as an adult, that has allowed me to do things like, run for US Senate. And it's very up and down being a candidate. And you have a lot of people coming at you with a lot of ideas, a lot of feedback, and that's leadership to an extent. So it's totally understandable. But yeah, I feel at this point, I just have the center strong and have a really clear vision of why we're doing this. It's not just to be a US Senator, it's really to serve the community. And that's always been a very stabilizing sentiment for me, just in terms of the work that we're doing. It's a lot of work, but when you're focused on the people, it makes it easier to do it every single day.
That's awesome. And I appreciate you being willing to share that. It's not a question that people are, necessarily used to receiving. I'm used to asking it because I'm a mental health therapist. So usually that is, just part of my day-to-day business. And, just because I don't appreciate asking others to do what I'm not willing to do. My mental health is a roller coaster these days. I will go from, just feeling really, really accomplished and sure in what I'm doing and therefore very fulfilled, to almost like panicked, like, oh my gosh, what if this doesn't work out? This being like the city council race. I also have a very important licensure exam coming up the week after. I did not plan that out well. But really just having moments where I do feel a little bit paralyzed by fear and uncertainty of the future. But what I'm learning is that I'm able to recognize when that's happening quickly. And one of the key components to mental health is recognizing what's going on within you. And so when I recognize that I'm paralyzed, I have to recenter myself with, as Morgan stated, okay, why are we doing this in the first place? I'm not running to win a race. I'm not running to get elected. I'm running to enact change. And that can happen whether or not I'm elected. So once I kind of bring that back to the forefront of my mind, kind of that calmness and that drive keep going. But apart from that, I think mental health is good. There's a lot of stress, helping carry others through the pandemic and just kind of what's going on in the world. But being able to do that is very, very humbling and very rewarding. So I'm really thankful and honored to have the opportunity to help others. So question.
I think that's such an important point.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
well, I see that you have a supporter who's saying, but I want you to win. So yeah, even if you would be okay, either way, got to focus on the prize. But just, the pandemic, I mean, I think a lot of us were really hard on ourselves. I know I experienced this where, oh my gosh, I'm used to just doing things all the time. And why am I just sitting here? And also then just the trauma of loss. I mean, this has been a very, very strange time. And to have people, even if they didn't pass away from COVID, but just to lose someone in this time where we can't be as connected, where it isn't as easy to travel, that is very traumatic. And, early on in the pandemic, we did a Zoom, a lot like this, the Zoom discussion, when this was becoming a regular part of life, that we didn't realize how much of a sustained regular part of life it would be, with Dr. Abdul Sayed from Michigan. And he was saying, what we're going through is a complex trauma. And some people, unfortunately, have life experience that has already prepared them for such a thing. But for a lot of people, this will be the first time that they've experienced a sustained complex trauma. And we have to have skills to cope with that. So I think, it's important to just remind ourselves that none of this is normal, layered on top of a society that hasn't really given us a lot of building blocks to be stable, unless we're perfect or absolutely lucky. And we don't have to live like this. So, looking out for one another, I think that's been inspiring to see a lot of the mutual aid efforts that have propped up during the pandemic, to just realize it's a moment of sadness that no one's coming to save us, but also that we have our communities that are banding together to do whatever we can to support one another is really important.
It was so interesting because early on in the pandemic, one of the things that I quickly learned, like maybe within the first week or two, starting to meet with my clients over telehealth instead of in the office, and kind of hearing their concerns about things shutting down and things changing, as they were describing kind of what their experiences with this were, at some point a light bulb went off and I was like, this is grief. And sure enough, client after client after client, and even talking to friends and relatives, I'm recognizing these signs of grief. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that's what we're all doing right now. We're all grieving the loss of something. For me, I cling to normalcy. Like, I love routine. I love just normal life. And I love feeling safe and secure. And the pandemic threw all of that out the window. And I definitely felt that sense of loss and had to give myself the opportunity to grieve that. And so I think, one of the important parts of this has just been to help people recognize what it is that they're dealing with. For some, it is complex trauma, as you mentioned. For others, it's grief. For others, it's something else. But this for sure has impacted probably most, if not all, people in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. And this is where, I don't know if you agree, but it's just so important to have leaders that are able to express empathy. I mean, I think that was one of the things that a lot of people were grateful for, a change in the federal leadership, that, we can disagree on policy positions and all of that, but at least having someone that was willing to feel and be open and acknowledging what was going on is really important. And that's why, we all have to continue to work hard to get people elected that are leading with empathy, that are going to be able to be that guiding force for us as we go on to, who knows, we don't really know what's to come, but I think I agree with you that it's just important to be able to give grace to one another as we navigate whatever era we're in. It's a strange time for sure.
And I think, one of the things that really compounded everything that was going on last year in the middle of the pandemic was the contentious election, where there was just no compassion, no empathy. And I think people felt that too. It was just blow after blow after blow in 2020. So glad it's over. But to kind of move forward to our next question, Morgan, in your opinion, why do you think that it is important for, and you may have already answered this, but if there's more that you want to expand on, great. If not, we'll move on to. But why do you think that it's important for political candidates to be focusing on mental health right now?
I think it's important because as a political candidate and an elected official, you have a platform. And when you have a platform, and it's not just political candidates, elected officials, of course, that have platforms. I mean, now we're in a time where influencers, variety of forms and professional background of that, or no professional background at all. You just have an account, right? But you have an opportunity to influence how people are thinking. And so in the political realm, in elected official realm, then I believe we have an opportunity to remove that stigma, like you're talking about, to let people know and expose our own vulnerabilities. I mean, I don't know if you've had this experience, but that was one of the most powerful things to me in beginning to run for office, is that there is a little bit of an expectation that you open up, that you share more about, which is very different from a typical professional environment where you just go, 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 go. But that no, in order for people to believe that you're going to have their best interests at heart, you also have to open up about yourself so that they know who they are trusting with that level of authority. And that's an opportunity too. So, I think that's a really powerful part of being in the political sphere. And it's something that I try to use my platform, the small one that I have so far, to let people know, especially in this area of mental health, that this is okay, that we all have a lot going on. And the fact that we're struggling in any given moment makes total sense based on where we are, based on the structures that we've set up, and we can do better. So that's a message that we're able to get across through the campaign, and not just leave people with it, but that we can do better. Let's back that up with some specific ideas of what better will look like, and that could be implemented.
Completely agreed. I've really tried to focus my campaign on vulnerability, and letting people see like the parts of campaigning that you wouldn't normally. It's like, for example, there was one night where I was up at 2:30 in the morning just because I'm thinking about ideas and worrying about the campaign. So I tweeted about it just to let people know, like, hey, this is a part of running for office that you may not see, but there may be some of you out there who are considering doing this one day. this might be something that you find yourself doing as well. And I want you to know that by my own experience. And also just being very candid with folks. The reason that I'm a counselor in the first place is because I lost my cousin to suicide in 2011. And so,
Sorry.
I appreciate that. But letting people know that while, yes, I want to serve my city, yes, I want to, make sure that people are housed and fed and that mental health care is prioritized here in Cincinnati City Hall. At the end of the day, the bottom line of my motivation is the loss of my cousin. This is, in essence, an act of grief. And I feel that people deserve to know that. And that requires me to be vulnerable. But I think a lot of people have appreciated that. So hopefully, we're entering into this new era where political candidates, instead of being, just figures or, in some cases, celebrities or, robots, we can start to recognize these are real people with real motivations and real struggles, real concerns, just like any of the rest of us. And to the point that you just made with your last statement, to your knowledge, in what you've learned about in your own life experience or just running for Senate, specifically for Ohio, what do you feel are some of the barriers as far as not being able to expand or take a progressive approach to mental health care expansion?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think in Ohio, we have to get over the stigma. And this is where, we probably are a little less open with some of the things that we're going through because it's not, I mean, I think it's one of our strengths as a state and as a culture where it's like you just keep going, you put the work in, you keep moving, don't complain too much, don't be too dramatic. But we have to recognize that there's some things that are worth articulating, and that isn't actually complaining or weakness or anything. That's what's going to allow us to be stronger and be able to show up better for our community. So that is something, connects to the prior to the prior comments that I was making about just the power of using your platform to let that door open and be okay. But otherwise, I mean, I think it comes down to money, like a lot of our problems, right? People don't necessarily have insurance that allows them to get regular access to mental health care. People don't have any spare income to be able to devote time to not just formal therapy appointments, but the other elements of what give a balanced life, making sure that you have time to work out and be able to socialize in a relaxing way and all of that. So this is all part of a balanced existence and should be standard, but we haven't really set up our economy to give people that kind of freedom, or it's increasingly becoming more difficult to do that compared to a generation ago. So that's something that really needs to be addressed. And there are things that can happen, like I said, city, state level. I'm focused on the federal, but I think it comes down to making sure people are more economically stable, but then also have the ability to access regular mental health care.
I was just in a forum with other city council candidates, and one of the questions posed was about mental health access. And, some of us were talking about, you can fund, mental health care programs and things like that. And that absolutely should be done. But you also have to look at some of the small barriers that maybe folks don't look at. So for example, transportation. If someone doesn't own a car and their therapist is on the other side of the city and telehealth is not available, which by the way, telehealth better be here to stay because that has removed such a barrier for a lot of people. It's not a fix all. But I think one of the things that we can do is in that regard is to, be very vocal towards the licensure board here in Ohio that really kind of delegates the rules and ethics as far as, telehealth and things like that, to let them know, like, we want this to stay and we want this to be as limitless, but still kept in check, if that makes sense, so that, things are still happening ethically and, all that good stuff. Childcare. A lot of women can't attend their therapy appointments because they don't have access to childcare for an hour at a time. And so, figuring out, okay, how do we remove that barrier? So even just getting down into like the nitty gritty small things that we may not think about, I think are are really important, even if we're talking about like the state as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah. And that some of these solutions, to your point, aren't necessarily that complicated. I mean, one thing that I think is completely connected to mental health, or your mental health state, is connection. And especially among our elderly, aging population, in a state where we haven't set up great public transportation, you become even more isolated as you age and it's harder to drive, that we need to be able to find opportunities for folks to connect. That applies to all ages, I would say, but that doesn't take much. I mean, for example, I'm one of the co-founders of a grassroots organization up here in Columbus called Columbus Stand Up. And during the entire pandemic, we were hosting community conversations, even outside in the middle of winter, more so then than ever, because we know when the temperatures change and we're more inside, it can be very isolating. But pulling people out and having just a discussion about what's on your mind, mental wellness, let's talk about it. And so that you're not potentially spending an entire week without any human interaction. That doesn't make us feel good. That's not a natural way for us as humans to be living. And so that can be something that even somebody who isn't a politician, who doesn't have a ton of money, just decides they're going to create an opportunity for people in their community to get together. And that can be very, very meaningful.
Agreed. So there are two things that come to mind based on that, which will kind of segue into our last question for you. There's actually two kind of things as far as legislation goes that I think are really important. Do I know exactly whose hands these are in or whose desks they have to end up on in order to be, signed into law or what have you? No, but I will tell you about them regardless. One, in the state of Ohio, it's actually not allowed for licensed professional counselors, so LPCs like myself, to work with Medicare patients. So this is a lot of people with disabilities and people over the age of 65 who have this. They have to see an LPCC or higher, which can be a barrier because not everyone seeks those higher levels of licensure. So, you might have LPCs like myself who are more than qualified to work with this population, but according to the Medicare rules, they can't. There's a bill that's actually, happening right now that is seeking to eliminate that barrier. So that would be huge.
That is huge. Yeah.
Locally here.
Well, and especially, oh, go ahead.
Nope, you go.
I was just going to say, I mean, especially thinking about culturally competent care, that if it's only certain categories of people and there's certain populations that are not represented in those categories of licensures and all of that, then we're not giving people options that make them feel comfortable to seek out care. I mean, I know my own family, hearing from people is like, well, like they're not really going to understand where I'm coming from, so I'm not going to go to that, right? And the options here, in Columbus or something. So I think that's really important, that we have a variety of options for people to seek that type of conversation and support. And sometimes it doesn't have to come down to the formal license in the same way. Yeah, not as restrictive. That makes sense to me.
Completely agreed. And there's another bill in the works that would, it's essentially to declare a state of emergency on childhood trauma. So just like the opioid epidemic, when there's a state of emergency here in Ohio declared on that, there's a lot of funding and resources made available to address the problem. Now, granted, we're still very much in the throes of said epidemic, but I think we would be in a much worse place still had that not been declared. Now, childhood trauma, like that is, I think, the next layer deeper than even like the opioid epidemic. So figuring out, okay, where is this bill and how do we get this accomplished? Or how do we make it better? How do we eventually get it on Mike DeWine's desk or, maybe our next governor's desk to make this happen? And also just making the public aware that there are initiatives happening to expand mental health care access in some regard. But sometimes, in the world of politics, things can take quite a bit of time. So my last question for you, Morgan, would be from your sought seat in government. What could you realistically do to help in this regard?
Yeah. Ooh, I lost my little air thing. So one, just to respond to what you were saying, because it resonated a lot, and the declaration of childhood trauma. I mean, so I was actually at a church service this past weekend in Cincinnati, New Prospect Baptist Church, and the Pastor Lynch there was saying, at this point, it feels like we should have crime tape around the entire city of Cincinnati, just based on the complexity and breadth of issues that we're seeing in the city. And that was a really powerful statement of honesty, and one, of course, tinged with sadness about where we're at. But we begin to change once we're starting to be honest about what's going on. And just to answer your direct question there, I mean, I think the most important thing is that we are electing politicians that have the mindset of getting in there to aggressively do something about what's happening on the ground at the community level. And that's the kind of politician I want to be, because I'm not really a politician, right? I'm just somebody that observed some things that weren't working and tried to figure out the system. And this is the latest place that I'm landing. And so we need to start looking more at our elected officials to really have our best interests at mind, not just the career, not just the next ladder, all of that. And that's really important. And the other thing that connects to that is not taking any money from corporations. A lot of the reason why we don't see more changes in our healthcare system is because we have people who are lobbying and bribing our politicians to stall progress. And we can't allow that to continue. And it happens a lot at the federal level. And we see it not just on mental health care, prescription drugs, hospitals, all of it. We really just need to completely wipe away the influence of corporate money over our legislative making process. And then, specifically, I support universal healthcare, and I believe that universal healthcare should include access to mental health care. And that's something that should not be tied just to who your employer is. That's something that just should be standard, because you live here, you matter, and you deserve to have regular access to everything you need to be stable and well. And that shouldn't just be possible if you're rich. This is a basic building block of life. And so that's something that there are legislative efforts to make that happen at the federal level. I would be supportive of that. And then just finally, a commitment to always just be in touch at the ground level and hear from people about specific legislation maybe I don't know about that, but I can advocate for and do whatever I can to try to fight to get it done.
I love that. From a city hall perspective, I'm not there yet, but last week, because we've had so many gun violence incidents that are involving children here in Cincinnati. And so, I wrote a proposal to implement a gun violence task force that the purpose of which would be to identify children grades 3 through 12 who have family histories of gun violence or domestic violence, or histories of living in neighborhoods that have experienced this frequently. Because I could go on and on about the generational trauma and compound trauma that is contributing to that. But if we're not identifying these children ahead of time, then we're not going to know that it was an issue until they become a victim or a perpetrator of gun violence. So I'm currently trying to put this in the hands of sitting council members, like, hey, can we get votes for this task force now before our new council comes on? That way it's already at least in the works. Before our new administration comes in, because Morgan, I'm not sure if you know this or not, all 9 council seats are open this year in Cincinnati.
I have heard that.
Yeah, so it's
you guys have quite a race on your hands.
It is very interesting indeed. So doing things like that, and like you said, also making sure that we are funding health resources, which include mental health resources here in our city. So I want to be very respectful of Morgan's time. I know you're busy. If people want to learn more about you or get in contact with your campaign, how can they go about doing that? And then after you share, we will transition to the second portion of the evening.
Well, thanks again for having me, Stacey. It was really great to bring more attention to this topic. Appreciate everything you're doing on that front. And yes, if anyone wants to follow up with me, I am very accessible. Our website's morganharper.org, but we're also on all social platforms as MH4OH, so Morgan Harper for Ohio. DM me, I respond, and look forward to continuing to connect with more folks in Cincinnati and throughout the state.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for, like I
Yeah,
said, just jumping in and being like, yes, let's do this. I love that level of just motivation and drive. So I appreciate you, and good luck in your respective race. Take care of your mental health as you go throughout this. And if you ever need to vent, you have my email now, so don't hesitate to reach out. And
I appreciate it.
I hope to hear from you somewhere down the line.
For sure. For sure. Thanks again. We'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Take
Bye.
care. All right, to jump into the second portion of the evening, I'm actually going